I'm very happy to be back at Yale. Some of you I haven't seen since the birthday party in 2003, and some of you I haven't seen since 1990-91 when I was here on sabbatical. So it's good to be back. And whether one can get a whole life and a whole book into an hour, I greatly doubt, but I will try to give you some of it. And I know there are quite a few people here who have read the book, and I'm sure there are quite a few others who haven't. So I'm sorry if I repeat something you've already heard, but I think you'll all hear something new. As you just mentioned, Hutchinson himself was called the father of ecology in the Washington Post and several other newspapers, but he always disclaimed that. He said the father of ecology was Darwin. And actually, when I published the book, I got a letter, a 4-page single-spaced letter back from Bert Lee, officially one of Hutchinson's students, and part of the letter described how Darwin had been the father of ecology, delving into various of Darwin's books, which was interesting. But although he did deny that he was the father of ecology, he did say that he did admit that he agreed that he was the paternity of many young and promising ecologists. So he was the father of ecologists, if not the father of ecology. Stephen Jay Gould called Hutchinson the greatest living ecologist when both of them were living. And in E.O. Wilson's preface to the book, or foreword to the book, he said, I'm going to read you a few quotes here, but mostly I'm just going to talk to you. G. Evelyn Hutchinson was a pioneer of modern ecology and justifiably called his founder, the one who brought the discipline into the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. He was a polymath, a master teacher, and one of the few scientists who could unabashedly be called a genius. And he compared him to Max Planck and to Einstein. He lived in the golden age of ecology, and perhaps he helped make the golden age of ecology. Hutchinson, Wilson said, was ideally suited for his major role in his forefront. He was interested in almost everything, and that indeed is true. Someone wrote that he was interested in everything except pop music and professional sports. But he did teach a rhythm course with a jazz musician right here at Yale, and Tom Lovejoy has a good story about Hutchinson and pop music. Maybe he'll tell you later. All right. So the next, is this right? I never saw Evelyn looking like this because I met him at the time of the last photo when he retired in 1971. But Tom must have, I think Tom knew Hutchinson longer and better than probably anybody in the room, but I'm not sure about that. You tell us. The next picture, the first picture, I never mentioned that. That little creature there is a potto. It's a prosimian that one of the Yale graduate students brought back from West Africa. And then the student left, didn't bring this baby, brought the parents. And I think unexpectedly it had a baby, and one of Hutchinson's students, Dean Anderson, raised this baby, and Hutchinson brought him to one of his animal behavior lectures in the last course of ecology that he gave, and supposedly the little potto was playing in his hair, or what was left of it, anyhow. And that indeed is Hutchinson as a small child with his mother. His mother was an interesting person, interested in women's suffrage, making speeches about how life could be better for women, not a professional social worker, but she did a lot of lecturing. She wrote a book, an actual marriage manual called Creative Sex. She didn't sign her name to it, just her initials, and she got a clergyman to write the preface. But she did try to convince people that contraception was a good thing, and it must have been quite shocking to some of her Cambridge friends, I think. And Evelyn wrote something about his mother and her friends, and I think this also shows Evelyn as a really good writer in giving you pictures through his words. One's mother's friends seemed essentially non-visual, dressing in brown, gray, and dark green, cryptic colors that faded into the landscape. They themselves were large-boned and vigorous, with a strictly constitutional passion for women's suffrage. When they rode through the town on their bicycles, it was difficult not to absorbed the impression that men were responsible for all the evil in the world. His father, in the next picture, if I get this right this time, whoop. Father on the right there, oh, I got a laser picture here. I think, did that work? No. That work? Well, anyway, the one on the left there is his mother at an older age, and who's in the middle? Gandhi. By this time, his father, who had only been a lecturer when Hutchinson was growing up, and the family, although pretty upper class, was not very rich. But by this time, he was the master of a college and had a natural professorship and entertained visitors. The woman on the left is the one that took care of Gandhi. And he wrote about his father, that he and his father made many trips together. They walked around Cambridge in the hills there and also in the hills of Cumberland. His father's knowledge, said Evelyn, included wildflowers, geology, meteorology, and British archaeology, which the two of them explored together. And Evelyn wrote that later in life, quote, when he explored new sites unaccompanied by his father, he always tried to think about what he was looking at in his father's terms. He always cared about what his father thought of him and whether he was living up to his father's hopes for him. And even as an old man, he wrote a letter to his younger sister, Dorothea, asking whether she thought that father would have approved of all of his work. So they were quite close. Let's see what the next one is here. This is Hutchinson as a Boy Scout during World War I. He had certain duties that he carried out. I think he's about 11 or 12 here. But the story I like best about his childhood occurred one night when Sir George Darwin and his wife were dinner guests, and there were two Sir Darwin, sons of Darwin's, living in Cambridge, both of whom were friends of the Hutchinsons. But at that time, Hutchinson must have been about 9, and his younger brother Leslie about 7, and he wrote that Lady Darwin, in a magnificent cerise dress, came to dinner at the Hutchinsons, along with George. 2 small boys watched from the top of the stairs. Evelyn and Leslie crept down the stairs quietly, locked the dining room door, turned off the electric light at the main switch, and threw the key in the garden. That's all we hear of the story. Whether they turned the lights on or not, I don't know. But at the very end of his life, when he received the Kyoto Award in Japan, he told this story and also said that he was glad no anti-evolutionary group had honored him for his anti-Darwinian act. Another thing that happened at this age, during World War I, a young woman that they called Gwendol was billeted with them. She was doing some war work in Cambridge, and she became a lifelong friend of the whole family. And during World War II, she had married a Jewish man, and during World War II, they were so afraid the Nazis were going to invade London that the Hutchinsons offered to have the little girl, whose name is Yamil, to come and stay with them during the war. So at age 2, she went off in a boat to New Haven. There are pictures of Evelyn picking her up, although it says it's a boy. And he and Margaret raised her until she was 5 when she went back home. So actually, Emile she became a ballet dancer and then a ballet instructor, and she is living in London at present. So I guess she knew Evelyn longer than any of you here. Okay. Well, then he went off to Gresham School, which was in Norfolk. And I think his father, seeing his interest in natural history and science, decided to send him to an English public school that specialized in science, or at least had some courses in science, not so much ancient languages. And actually, he took his Cambridge University exams in chemistry, physics, and mathematics. There were, at that time, no biology exams. I mean, the word biology was taught, but no such exams to get into Cambridge. And the amount of these sciences that he learned as a high school student stood him in good grace the rest of his life. I think he was always better trained in these hard sciences, as we call them, than most, at least during my period, most American ecologists were so trained. And he was able to use that in a lot of his work. And He also belonged to a natural history club. Everywhere, he seemed from the youngest time there was always a natural history club, even in elementary school. And he belonged to all the 7 sections, including being secretary of entomology and of geology. And all the notebooks from this Natural History Club are still extant. 1920, the most noteworthy achievements of the society for that year, first was Hutchinson's discovery of a water bug new to Britain, and he was already into water bugs. And he also was the first prize winner for a paper he wrote about variation in the spittlebug. But his comment on all of this was that at his school it would have been better to be good at cricket. He wrote about this, though, and I'll put him in the next picture. This is actually at Cambridge. I remember one Good Friday, probably 1919, when the day was free after chapel, but he was still in his chapel clothes, using such willpower to practice titrations in the chemistry laboratory over and over before I allowed myself a visit to my favorite ponds and woods, feeling that I should have to be an adequate chemist if I were to become a good field zoologist. Of course, he wrote this many years later, but it sounds good anyhow. He did at this age, he was at this age writing letters back and forth and visiting entomologists and becoming quite an expert at the group he had chosen, which was the water bugs. He decided very early in elementary school that butterflies were too commonplace and he needed to do something more esoteric. And by the time he got to Cambridge, people were writing to him for advice on identifying their water bugs and related creatures. There's one. And that family, Corixidae, is one of the 2 families that he was particularly interested in. However, he wasn't just interested in water bugs, he was also interested in stoats, and there was a lot that was written about stoats. I discovered after a while that they're just weasels, and actually this one is probably the same or very similar species to ours. But he was interested in the variation in their coat color, and just before they took their final exams at Cambridge, he and Grace Pickford, who became his first wife, but who was his field companion at Cambridge University, and 2 other people. One was Robin Hill, responsible for the discovery of the light reactions in photosynthesis, and the other was another young woman, a co-student who became a limnologist. So here they are. The one on the left is the future limnologist. They called her Klops because she was so big, and the one down there, the little one that looks almost like a boy, for which she was sometimes mistaken at Yale, is Grace Pickford, who became his wife. This is a later picture, however. So they went to a whole group of the Channel Islands looking for stoats of different colors and had lots of adventures and came back and did very well on their exams. That's Penelope Jenkin, is the limnologist, and I interviewed her at a very old age in a remote part of North Wales, and she was still a very feisty person who had done a lot of good limnology, had been a professor at a British university, and actually influenced Evelyn early on with his limnology work. After that, when he graduated from Cambridge with he won a fellowship, a Rockefeller Fellowship, to study at the Naples Zoological Station. And there's funny correspondence there because he got a letter. He wanted to know what equipment they had or could get for him, and got a letter back addressed to Miss Evelyn Hutchinson, and he had to explain that he was really male. Later, he always told people it was Evelyn, as in Evelyn Waugh, who was more famous. But before, he didn't make much progress with the endocrinology of the octopus, but he got very involved in love of Italy and learned Italian, later lectured in Italian, and went back to Italy to do some work on lakes. But before his year was up, he got a job offer to be a senior lecturer in South Africa at Witwatersrand University. And his parents and several other people told him, no, don't go there, because Professor Fantham is a terribly difficult person to get along with. He's thrown the last lecturer forcibly out of the laboratory. But I think that Evelyn, who spent most of his time in Cambridge or near Cambridge, really wanted to explore a new world. He was a zoologist. He wanted to see some new animals, not so much lions and elephants, but particularly Onychophora, which is a small phylum somewhere between the annelids And the arthropods, though I think molecular biologists have now decided it's nearer the arthropods, which is, has been, it's a Guano species that actually probably goes back to the, or at least its progenitors go back to the Burgess Shale 550 million years ago. But they were several species in South Africa, and he did find them, and he actually wrote a little paper about them in 1927. So off he went, and just as predicted, Fantham didn't get along with him and actually fired him from teaching after the first year. But later there was a trial, and this was cleared up. But nevertheless, they couldn't fire him altogether. They still had to pay him because he had a 2-year contract. And at that point, a professor at the University of Cape Town, an Englishman named Lancelot Hogben, who had already done some very good scientific work in England and was somehow connected either with Evelyn's father, who knew everybody, or with somebody that was at Gresham School, offered to have him come down and grace Pickford as well and do some work on the dry lakes or pans in his part of South Africa, which they did. And that was the beginning of Evelyn's work in limnology, and that's when he decided that was going to be his future career. And he had really very little literature to go on at that point, but when he, after he left South Africa and before he came to Yale, he stopped in Cambridge and found the work of the Europeans, Thiedemann and other of the Europeans, who really looked at the chemistry and physics of lakes as well as the creatures in them and adopted that kind of approach. And I think we can, this is a later picture done by Marion Cohn of all the creatures that were named after Hutchinson, and most of these creatures, I think with the exception of the turtle, he even worked at fish for a while, he had worked on. So this whole world of aquatic creatures was part of the work that he did with Grace and with another young woman from the university. They didn't publish these papers until they got to Yale, and then they published them, interestingly enough, in European journals because I think Evelyn felt that was where the real limnology was happening. He has sometimes been called the father of limnology or the father of American limnology, but there were other American limnologists before him, and surely the Europeans were doing good work. So maybe we can call him the father of the new limnology, incorporating statistics and mathematics, which hadn't happened before. Well, after his time was up, he was worried about what he was going to do next. And someone has just written a long article about Hutchinson's 2 years in South Africa, a South African woman professor who sent me the article. And she found something that I didn't find, and that was letters of Evelyn that he wrote to his father. A whole bunch of letters. I actually looked in the archives today, and I found more. I don't know, they might have been given to Yale later after I had looked for them. But it's very interesting. One of the letters, he's telling his father what he would like to do. He would like to spend 6 years more altogether in South Africa, but that didn't prove possible. But he was applying for jobs, one job as a demonstrator, like a lab instructor at Cambridge University under Gardner, one of his professors. And he even applied for a job being a teacher in an elementary school, which tried to teach children 4.5 to 10, the scientific method. Well, fortunately, he didn't have to do either of those things because Lancelot Hogben found out about a fellowship at Yale, which he could perhaps take to study embryology with the famous Ross Harrison, Ross Harrison had invented tissue culture sometime around 1910. Had become quite famous for that because she could look at live nerve cells in vitro, which is something that hadn't been done before. But he had been for several years now the head of the department at Yale and also had quite an extensive research group working on particularly spotted salamanders, but other amphibians and doing experimental embryology, transplanting limbs from one place to another. So it was pretty late, but Evelyn applied for this fellowship. He sent everything on, answered all the questions on a telegram and sent them in. But it was too late. All the fellowships had been given out. But it turned out that a termite man had just left Yale to go to Berkeley, and there was an instructorship open. And sight unseen, they asked him if he would like it. So first he inquired as to whether Grace could have a place in the laboratory, but assured that that was true. He wrote one word in the telegram, accept, and both of them went off to Yale. in 1928. Before he left, also, he found the book, again back in Cambridge, that Charles Elton had written, Animal Ecology, and Evelyn said that if there had been someone between Darwin, and another progenitor, it was Elton who wrote all about food chains. Hutchinson himself carried it much further, but there has been some discussion about how much influence there was between the two. They were not close friends, but someone pointed out they lived over the same lifespan. Hutchinson was born in 1903 and Elton 1900, and they both died in the same year. But it seems to me that those 3 years made a difference because Elton's book came out in 1927. In 1927 was when Evelyn was looking for a job and had really not accomplished very much. However, there's two interesting stories about Elton. One of them is in the book, and it was a story from Max Dunbar, who's in my book, those of you who read it, in the first crop of students, although he was not actually a Hutchinson graduate student. He was an advanced Oxford undergraduate who had a research year at Yale and decided to work with Hutchinson. And they corresponded after that for a long time. Dunbar became a professor at McGill and did a lot of interesting work on Arctic limnology. But Dunbar had been in Oxford walking down the Broad Street one day, and he saw what he said, the two progenitors of most of modern ecology, Hutchinson and Elton, walking down the street, engaged in deep conversations. And he said, wouldn't it be good if we could know what they were talking about? Of course, we can't. But I met Elton, too. I did a degree, I have to say something about myself here, undergraduate degree at Cornell, starting in ornithology and also in zoology, and a master's degree in plant taxonomy and genetics. I got married in between to this fellow over here, so I had to stay at Cornell. And then subsequently, I did a PhD in experimental ecology, evolutionary ecology. And that's when I read all of Hutchinson's books and papers and became a Hutchinsonian, even dedicated my thesis to him. But I didn't meet him during that period of time. But in between those two things, Glenn over here won a Guggenheim, which enabled him to spend a year studying physics in Oxford. And I came along with our 3 children, quite small, and very fortunately got a job as a demonstrator, which is just a sort of glorified lab instructor, in the botany school. But the first semester, botanists and zoologists took a course together in taxonomy and evolution, something I knew about. And so I got to teach them that. And I was much more excited about it than the Oxford students. They did the lab, but there were no lab exams, so they didn't really hang around a long time. But all the people whose books I had read, I taught a little ecology course in the meantime. David Lack, who was a close friend of Hutchinson's, E.B. Ford, Darlington, the Kettlewell, all these people were teaching freshmen, and most of them were in the lab, Lack with his ring gulls and the melanic moths and all these things. So I was very excited about that. And then this third term that year, I was the lab instructor, teaching assistant for ecology. And we did a lot of field trips in and around Oxford, some to famous places like Wytham Woods. But one day, an elderly man, or so it seemed to me at that time, came with us that the professor I was working with, Stanley Waddell, had invited. And the students didn't pay much attention, but Stan introduced me to him, and it was Charles Elton. And, I knew I'd read the book. He wrote it in 1927. I didn't even think he was still alive. But we had a wonderful discussion about, I was working on salt marshes at that time on the North Sea. So that was a very good experience for me. So I'm sure they had a good discussion on the Broad, but I don't know what it was. All right. I'll go back to this in a minute. Harrison was very good to Hutchinson, and Hutchinson gave him a lot of credit. His field was completely different from Hutchinson's, and he didn't ever work in embryology. He immediately got put into undergraduate teaching, and he was too busy to either get a graduate degree, which his wife, Grace Pickford, got a PhD at that point. But he did have to teach embryology, which he wasn't probably an expert at. But Harrison allowed him to do a whole lot of different things, which you wouldn't think would be a good route to being a tenured assistant professor. So he published papers on all kinds of things, even psychoanalysis in those first years. But also, Harrison nominated him to be the chief biologist for the Yale North India expedition. And Hutchinson wrote a whole plan, and it went through the president, and they went off for almost a year and went over mountain ranges and up to lakes that were at 18,000 feet. And Hutchinson had to collect everything. He actually did some taxidermy. That was a skill he'd learned in England that nobody else knew about. But mostly, he studied the high elevation lakes and also the people who lived there. This is North India, but it's now Ladakh. And the Ladakhi people the women were clothed in these beautiful dresses with lots of turquoises. And in some of these lakes, it was so cold that the ice hardly melted, and it was not possible for fish to live there. So sometimes the top predator would be a cladoceran. He wrote a book about this experience called The Clear Mirror, which was a literary success, although I don't think it sold very many copies until it was reprinted by some people locally here. He wrote it in 1937, and it was reprinted in 1973, The Pattern of Life in Goa and Indian Tibet. And the word pictures in this book, and I think some of it might be in Dave Skelly and all's book. I'm just going to read you one little paragraph about lakes in the desert. They vary in color within a restricted range of blues and greens, just like the turquoises that they resemble, which Ladakhi women wear. Each shade of blue or green sums up in itself a structure and a history in the lake, that is, for each lake is a small world, making its nature known to the larger world of the desert by its colors. In this particular lake, almost 18,000 feet, the last snow of June melts, but there are no fish, too extreme conditions for fish, but 3 crustaceans, tiny, submicroscopic, one black, one red, and one pale gray. In the blue water, black spots move leisurely here and there, and still tinier bright red points, because these are, they're microscopic or submicroscopic. You can actually see something's there. Little ones, the red ones can be seen skipping about among them, and in the deeper water, small pale gray shrimps scurry about. I think you can all picture that. And here is the North India expedition. They camped. They had very primitive conditions. Sometimes rode elephants. They're all dressed up in what are supposed to be Ladakhi or Tibetan. I don't even know which one is Evelyn in this picture. I figured out. And he made his, later in life, later at Yale, people made fun of his clumsy way with glassware. I mean, apparently glass tubes were falling out of his pockets with holes in them, crashing on the ground. But during this expedition, none of the equipment he'd sent over seemed to have gotten there. And he had to scrounge pieces of old equipment and make himself. He did quite a lot of experimental work and seemed to have done that very well. And maybe later in life he really preferred to be a theorist, but at this point he was doing a lot of experimental ecology. And he wrote letters to Grace Pickford throughout this expedition, explaining his experiments, sometimes even with graphs, even though they were about to get divorced. That had been decided earlier, and that did happen. And the folklore is, and I've never been able to tell whether this story is actually true, he met his next wife, also an English woman, Margaret, on the boat coming back from had to go to Europe first from India, to the United States, and she was a singer and was singing on the boat, and they fell in love. So they were married for 50 years, though sadly the last 10 years of that she had Alzheimer's, and Hutchinson took care of her at home with some help from various graduate students and other people for the last 10 years of her life. She was not interested in science. Graduate students told me that had known her that they were invited to the Hutchinsons for sherry and a concert that Margaret would give. I see people nodding here. And if she would ask a graduate student what he was working on, and after the first 2 sentences, her eyes would glaze over and she would go and get some more sherry or whatever. But But they did have in common art and music and literature. And when she was away for some time in Italy, he wrote her the most wonderful letters about the art exhibits and the concerts he went to. He was an inveterate letter writer, wonderful for a biographer, because there are hundreds and hundreds of letters. He wrote to his graduate students. They wrote back to him for years and years. He wrote letters to both of his wives here. And later on, I think there's a picture coming, he wrote literally hundreds of letters to the famous writer Rebecca West, who had seen one of his articles in the American Scientist. He wrote a whole series of articles in the American Scientist for years and years about all aspects of science. And she wrote to him and said she wanted to meet him. She was already a quite famous novelist. And after a whole series of funny telegrams, she finally did meet him, and that was in the 40s, and they remained friends until she died in 1983. She also wrote for the New Yorker, reporter as well as a novelist, for the New Yorker and the Herald Tribune, and she would come over to New York quite often so they could get together. Well, here we finally come to the most important thing. This is a family tree that Marion Cohn, the wife of Alan Cohn, one of Hutchinson's students, made in 1971 for his retirement booklet of L&O, Limnology and Oceanography. And it's not complete, of course. It only goes up to 1971, and there's at least 2 more generations after that. In a sense, I consider myself a Hutchinsonian, but only by his writings, but that would have been the next generation. And many of these people, as you can see, had a whole lot of graduate students in a lot of different fields, from limnology to animal behavior, oceanography, all kinds of different things. Larry Slobodkin, I don't know if I can make this work, but he's up on the right there. I had many graduate students at Stony Brook, and I got to know him quite well because he wrote an article together for the English journal Endeavor. And his graduate students all gave talks, as former graduate students, at his retirement party in a whole lot of different fields, quite like Hutchinson. So I think he was the progenitor of many important young ecologists. The first one was Gordon Riley. And I've got time, you'll have to look in the book for a whole lot about Gordon Riley. He started working in biogeochemistry, because that's exactly what Hutchinson was famous for in the earlier days of his career, and eventually became a marine biologist and had his own group in Dalhousie. And then there was Ed Devey, who may have been the only one in that period who managed to step over the barrier between the botany department and the zoology department, both in the same building, but as if there was a wall in between, and people usually didn't go from one to the other. But Ed Devey had done a master's in the botany department, and then he wanted to work on lake cores, and apparently nobody in the botany department was very interested in that, but Evelyn was. And so he came over and worked with Hutchinson, and he did a remarkable PhD thesis, probably the first one, at least in this country, on paleolimnology. But he also studied all the living creatures as well, in a whole, both in Lindsley Pond, which was Hutchinson's favorite place near here, but in a whole lot of other lakes. And then there was Tommy Edmondson on the left there, W.T. Edmondson, famous for his later reversal with his graduate students of pollution of Lake Washington in Seattle, and I think that was the first time that had been shown to be possible on a major scale. But he came into Evelyn's lab as a high school student because his brother, I think, had given him a microscope when he was about 12, and he discovered rotifers in the pond water, and the family moved to New Haven. He had a very good high school teacher who took him over to Yale and introduced him to several people in the department. And Hutchinson had him move into his lab. And when Hutchinson went to North India, he collected, among other things, rotifers, which he thought he could work on. And he decided that actually Tommy, who was, I think at that point, I think by then he was an undergraduate student at Yale, worked on him on almost all of them, or most of them, and was very surprised when the paper came out and it was Edmondson and Hutchinson, because he didn't think a professor would do that. And actually, Evelyn rarely put his name on his graduate students' papers. Tommy did a PhD on the rotifers and invented several new things. And he also was a great help to me with this book because he had all kinds of sources that he kept sending me and was very encouraging. And here are some creatures. Glenn said I should put some creatures in for people who are not familiar with water bugs that Hutchinson worked on. So now we have quickly a whole bunch of creatures that Hutchinson and later his students worked on. And the point is here that there's a great variety of them. So I'm just going to go through these. That's a water bug. Also, copepods, paper about copepods. He even looked at beetles. Another of his friends did beetles when he was little. And I put that in blue-footed booby. He did not work on them, but he did write a great big compendium book on guano, fascinating book that I thought I might have been the only one who read the whole 500 pages, but at a recent meeting, I met a young man who was actually doing a thesis about guano. He had read the whole book as well. That's really interesting, I think. But the guano book also talks about El Nino. I think the first time that anybody got together a whole lot of different factors, which he measured, which seemed to be related to El Nino. And it's a quite Darwinian book because he wrote letters to all kinds of people, ship captains, people who ran fertilizer businesses, all kinds of islands in the Pacific, and put all that data together. Even guano from ancient extinct organisms. Hutchinson also worked on plants, so that's not so widely known. He wrote a whole volume of a treatise, 4-volume treatise on limnology on aquatic plants. And he actually worked on land plants. That's something he probably otherwise didn't do, but this was part of biogeochemistry too. He was interested in lycopodiums. They're all in different genera now, but they accumulate aluminum, and he was correlating. He got his graduate students to send him different species from the United States and England, correlating the morphology and the aluminum content, and that became part of one of the volumes of the biogeochemistry treatise that he did for the American Museum of Natural History. There's some rotifers. One down the bottom seems to have got lost. And Daphnia, several of his Johnny Brooks and other people worked on Daphnia. Godosserin. Alan Cohn worked on cone shells, spelled differently, marine cone shells. And Hutchinson thought that each of his students, they shouldn't be taxonomists, but they should really know well some group of organisms that they were working on. And several of his students worked in marine ecosystems. Howard, H.T. Odom, sometimes called Tom and sometimes Howard, did a lot of ecosystem work in marine systems. But one of the first was Tom Garreau, who I think was the only Hutchinson student that got both a PhD and a medical degree. And he, when he finished both of them, was offered a job in Jamaica, actually, at the medical school, but what he really wanted to do was work on the coral reefs. And someone had told him that there was a marine station in Jamaica. He got down there and discovered that was not true at all, but he started one, Discovery Bay. And later on in my career, I was teaching marine biology in Jamaica during January terms, and I actually went over, I was at a different station, went to Discovery Bay to see what I could find out about Tom Garreau, because he died quite young. But he and his wife Nora, who was also a marine biologist, actually worked out a lot of the relationship between the alga, the zooxanthellae, and the selenarite, the animal, coral animal, and wrote about it. And I used those papers with my students. But at any rate, Tom Garreau was an important marine biologist, and his son, also Tom Garreau, is a coral expert. More coral. And Tom Lovejoy worked on birds in Brazil. And MacArthur worked on wood warblers, Purulid. This is a black-throated green warbler. Many of us studied warblers, and Hutchinson always said MacArthur knew his birds. And MacArthur did work on other birds later, but I belonged to a field zoology club at Cornell, Jordan and I, and all of us knew our warblers, so we didn't think that was so difficult. I thought zooplankton, when I took a plankton course as a graduate student, much more difficult than warblers. That one's actually up in the spruce trees, see by the lichens. And actually, Maxine Watson, one of his students, worked on mosses, and my students don't always believe that mosses have sex, but they do. The sperm from the male has to go through water and arrive at the female, true of tree ferns too. And this Maxine wanted to do but she was doing population biology too, and you can actually age each shoot of this particular kind of moss, but she wanted to do some experiments on competition between the first phase, called the protonema. So she sent Maxine to me after I had met him in 1971 to see if I could help her. Well, I'm not very good at this kind of culture, but in my department there was a student of MacArthur who had done his PhD on cellular slime mold, so he was able to help Maxine. And then there was Alison Jolly, who became an expert on lemurs, especially the ring-tailed lemur. And finally, we have an anthropology student, Merdine Anderson, who claimed Hutchinson as well. She worked on the people that lived in Lapland and herded reindeer, and she and Hutchinson got into all kinds of discussions about the behavior of reindeer. So a whole lot of different fields that they worked in. And there's some reason I'm telling you this because, how do we get that one? Oh, sorry. There's been a lot of writing in history of science on research schools. A research school started in Europe, particularly in Germany. Hutchinson's father worked with Emil Fischer, got a medical degree actually in Germany. Harrison had done that too. The classic research schools, I wrote some things down here. There was usually one subject, some set of questions they were trying to answer, some set of tools, and there was usually a Herr professor. Harrison himself was called the chief, and I think the students are quite fond of him. He wasn't quite like some of the dictatorial professors in Europe, but it was definitely a research school. And I wrote something about Hutchinson's research school in an early paper, and I was criticized by another historian of science saying that wasn't a research school, that was a research group. And he might be right, because Hutchinson's students were not like that. They worked not only on all these different organisms, but in all these different fields. And Hutchinson worked in most of these fields himself, not in marine biology or biological oceanography, and not specifically in animal behavior, but most of the others there, as well as in some other fields. I just put the science ones in because there wasn't room, but he also worked on the history of animal art from illuminated manuscripts. He also wrote papers in history of science and had students in history of science. So he was a polymath, and there's a whole chapter in the book about that. One thing the review, some of you saw the review in Science, the one thing the reviewer did note was that I talked about Hutchinson encouraging women. And actually, Hutchinson respected women scientists, and I think that started at Cambridge, because at that time, women could not get Cambridge degrees, not till much, much later. His younger sister, Dorothea, went to Cambridge and completed her work, and she was able to go to a graduation ceremony in her late 80s to get her actual degree. And another one of her friends, whom I also did interview, who was in Hutchinson's class, was in her 90s by then. But they were able, in Hutchinson's time, to work in the lab with the men. And so we got to know these women quite well. And among them, there were 5 women, including Grace Pickford and 2 of the others, who became well-known scientists in quite a variety of fields. One of them in astronomy, who ended up at Harvard, Payne Slobodkin. So he did both respect, but also help and empower women. Even after they left Yale, he kept track of them and wrote to them and helped them to find positions. And here are just a couple of them. Alison Jolly, who actually did her work largely in animal behavior, and Donna Haraway, who's now quite a well-known feminist theorist, and she did her work in history of science with Hutchinson. And indeed, he encouraged other women who were not his students. Up there is Janet Brown, who is now a professor at Harvard. He helped her with her first book, which was about biogeography, one of the things Hutchinson was always interested in. And the other one is Sharon Kingsland, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he wrote a very good book about population biology, and there are letters and letters between them while she was writing this book, and it really gave her a good start. And the one down below, some of you may know, Catherine Skinner, she taught a course with Hutchinson. I think she was his only woman colleague in biogeochemistry in the late 60s, also with someone named Jim Walker, as a graduate course, and she is still teaching in the geology department. She also worked in the medical school on crystallography and bone. So he's had a lot of women colleagues and friends, and there are many, many letters. Some of them gave me whole series of letters, most of which I didn't use in the book. He also was a close friend of Margaret Mead's, helped her write one of her later books. She stayed at his house in Yale when she came to talk here, and he stayed in her house, and her husband, Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson had been an elementary school student with Hutchinson in England, so he kept up with him all his life. And during the period when the two of them were together, there were the Macy conferences in cybernetics and feedback conferences, and they invited Hutchinson to come to those conferences. And he wrote that he was just a listener, but actually he wrote a paper and gave a talk, and it was printed as a paper that sort of combined ecology and cybernetics on cycles, which became quite well known. And here he is at this period. He still looks quite English. He never lost his English accent, and one of my friends who studied American, who married an Englishman, who came here and did an environmental science degree early, or whatever it was called then, said she never could understand his lectures. His accent was so thick. And here we can't say only good things about Hutchinson. A friend interviewed someone named Ted Napora, who was actually a Gordon Riley student. But before Gordon Riley went to Dalhousie, it must have been, because he took Hutchinson courses, and he said that MacArthur came to his office to play darts. That was something I didn't find out. But he said that Hutchinson had a bad habit of standing right in front of what he wrote on the blackboard. And after he had done a very nice drawing, probably a cadoceran, Napora waited patiently for Hutchinson to move to the side so that he could copy it. However, he didn't, and he looked down and saw that Ted had not copied it and told him he needed to pay better attention to the lecture. So he had his foibles as well. But he was still dressed in tweeds when I came to talk with him in 1990, but not probably as natty as this. Okay. So if he was the father of modern ecology, or at least so, in my view, he was, together with many of his graduate students. All these different fields came into being during his time. Radioecology, ecosystem ecology, and it should be American biogeochemistry because that was well established in Europe before Hutchinson. Population ecology and theoretical ecology. I'm not saying he was the only one that did these things, but he certainly was the one who incorporated all these fields into ecology. And here we start with the radioisotopes. He was the first one to use radioisotopes as tracers. And actually that work, I looked back and discovered that he had actually started that work in 1941 during the war, when he managed to get a little bit of P32 and took it out in a leaky boat. And at that time it was Tommy Edmondson in the boat, so he told me about it. And they didn't actually get enough of it to really get any good data. But it was something that he had in mind quite a while before he actually did it with von Bowen. That was the first paper they published in 1947. And they essentially sprinkled P32 in the lake and saw where it went and how it cycled. And it was the first time that had been done. Actually, some people at Dalhousie were doing rather similar experiments, but they didn't know why they were doing them. I mean, they had better equipment. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't understand, they didn't have the hypothesis that Hutchinson had. They were just seeing what happened to the phosphorus. But von Bowen and Hutchinson published theirs first, and the Dalhousie group had written to Hutchinson to discuss these experiments before they published them. The second paper, there are two papers. The second one is a lot better science than the first one, but this is the one that's always quoted. And then came Raymond Lindemann, who had already done his PhD. He was, I think, the first postdoc, and they're on that diagram family tree that you saw, all those little creatures flying around and walking around are the postdocs. If you look on, each have a name. He had quite a lot of postdoctoral students. And they essentially together wrote a paper called The Trophic Dynamic Aspect of Ecology. And that paper, it was Lindemann's data, but Hutchinson really added a lot to the paper, and that has been documented earlier by Bob Cook and also to some extent by Joel Hagen and myself. But the paper was turned down because the senior limnologist that reviewed it said it was too early for anything theoretical in ecology, in limnology, and that Lindemann should go do 100 more lakes before he came to any general conclusions. But Hutchinson wrote to the editor of Ecology, who was the young Tom Parks at that point, explaining why this paper was important and that they should publish it. And Parks stuck his neck out and did publish it. Sadly, Lindemann died. He had some kidney problem before the paper was published. But it was the first paper in ecosystem or systems ecology. And you can see him in the lab there with his glassware during this period. So I think he did go on doing experiments for some of this time. And then we get to biogeochemistry in the US. This is the picture of the two of the European founders of the field. And what Hutchinson did was to discover the work of Vernadsky. And Hutchinson, I don't think he read Russian, but he did read almost every other language. And it had been translated into French, but Vernadsky's work had not been translated into English. And he had that done at Yale so that his students could read these papers. And that became his major project. The American Museum of Natural History actually gave him a large grant he didn't do all the work himself, to collect biogeochemistry in many different kinds, and quite a few of his students worked on biogeochemistry. In fact, by 1948, he was so well known as a biogeochemist, more so than an ecologist, the U.S. Geological Survey tried very hard to hire him, and they offered him this plum job. He could work on anything he liked. They would get him all the equipment he needed. He didn't have to write grant proposals. They would do all of his paperwork. And Hutchinson wrote back that he'd been offered several jobs, and this one was the most tempting, but that he wouldn't be able to have graduate students if he did that. And he'd already produced 4 young men at the beginning. They were all men who were well on their way to becoming important ecologists themselves, and he didn't want to give that up. So I think the fraternity of ecologists was an extremely important part of Hutchinson's career. And he had a particular method of teaching graduate students, which I think started in his own experiences as what he called a hunter and gatherer at Cambridge University. And Cambridge University is a character in the book. I wrote a lot about that. It was probably, many people thought it was the center of intellectual life in the whole world in the interwar period. It certainly was that was true in science, but other fields as well. And he sort of decided that American students were much too, they had too many exams. They were sent down a path, and they had to do this lab experiment and that lab experiment, and that was not even a good way to teach undergraduates, much less graduate students. But he also inherited some of this from his professor at Yale. So we are here. Okay. And then we get to population ecology, and there were quite a few students, and Hutchinson himself who worked in population ecology. You can tell the era, there's Larry Slobodkin without a beard, and also with what's that? Who knows what that is? A slide rule, right. He worked on a lot of different things, but one of his first work was on red tides, dinoflagellates, and Robert MacArthur, who did this famous work with all the warblers. We were all jealous because we knew all those warblers, but we never thought of doing such a study with them. And of course, we only saw them on migration when they went through Ithaca or East Rock over here. But he saw them where they were breeding and figured out how they divided up the niche space on a spruce tree. Very good paper. Then we get to the niche theory, for which Hutchinson is probably most famous. And there's been a lot of discussion about in the literature, well, starting back in the 70s, including a paper that was called Santa Rosalia. We'll get to that. That was one of Hutchinson's most famous writings. Santa Rosalia was a goat. Apparently in the church of Santa Rosalia there were goat remains. But there were a lot of people saying detrimental things about both MacArthur and Hutchinson, that competition had been too much emphasized, and some of the ratios that Hutchinson had put out didn't turn out to be true, perfectly true, but whenever you put out a number like 1.3 to 1, somebody will do lots of experiments and find a different number or find that yours doesn't hold up. But many people, and MacArthur too, had a lot of hypotheses that other people tested, and a lot of good work was done. But I do think that the niche theory, I wrote this in my last chapter called Concluding Remarks, has turned out to be extremely useful. I used it a lot in my own work. And Hutchinson, Robert Colwell and Thiago Rangel, both now I think at University of Connecticut, wrote an interesting paper which was too late for my book, but they wrote, it was about not only ecology but biogeography. Hutchinson's realized niche has come to express not only the effects of species interactions, as Hutchinson intended, but also constraints of dispersal limitation and the lack of contemporary environments corresponding to the fundamental niche. It has been used to classify and map environments, model potential species distributions under past, present, and future species, and simulate stochastic models that encompass speciation, extinction, and evolutionary adaptation to changing environments. Quite a few things it can be used for. And I should just, without going through this diagram, I used a much simpler one with squirrels in the book, but he's talked, on the left are the environmental characteristics, including a thermocline you can see in the middle there, and those small circles are small phytoplankton, and large circles are large phytoplankton, and S1 and S2 are two different consumers. And there also was unutilized or unavailable niche space, and neither one of them none of fit into. These two authors claimed, and I think they're probably right, that between the time he wrote the original paper in 1957 and the time he wrote his textbook in 1968, he actually made changes and improvements and larger encompassing of his niche theory, which have been quite useful. All right. Back in 1957, when MacArthur was still a graduate student, a professor at Duke had his graduate students interview or write to students of Hutchinson and ask them what their experience was with Hutchinson as a professor. And it was very interesting because this was done at the same, while they were still students, not 10 or 20 years later. And MacArthur wrote this. First of all, MacArthur wrote that Hutchinson had used methods of radioactive tracers in a novel way, combined with a knowledge of theoretical hydrodynamics to explain motion of phosphorus in a pond. He was saying that several different examples of how Hutchinson used what he'd learned in the physical science in his studies of ecology. And then he says, I believe a few words about him as a teacher are in order. He never made appointments. Students go into his room to discuss, not to get advice, and are treated as equals no matter how far-fetched their ideas. I believe he's influenced me the most by his genuine enthusiasm about the small, novel ideas we may have. This enthusiasm is the most sincere sort of encouragement. I feel rather foolish having said all this in print, in a letter, but I hope it may contribute to the understanding of a remarkably fine man. Between 1950 and 1958, there were 13 different PhD students of Hutchinson's, and 8 of them became major ecologists, say. In terms of theoretical ecology, these are 3 of his famous papers. Beyond the concluding remarks, which was at the end of a conference, a very diverse conference, and Hutchinson didn't have good things to say about some of it, but that's when he introduced his n-dimensional niche concept. And another most famous one, Homage to Santa Rosalia. Why are there so many different kinds of animals, which has been much quoted. In one sense, there were so many different kinds of animals because there were so many different kinds of plants or other kinds of food the animals were eating. But another one that I liked is the paradox of the plankton. These plankton seemed to be living in quite uniform environments, and yet they all seemed to be managing to coexist. And of course, the competitive exclusion theory was rampant at that time. And he figured out a lot of ways that they managed to do that, temporal ways, water temperatures, quite a few different things. And I like this one too, cotopathology for the ornithologist. And since I started as an ornithologist and never got to copepods for quite a long time, he just wanted to explain some of the ideas to people who were not studying limnology. But all of these articles start with, if not water bugs, at least freshwater ecology organisms, the lake organisms. And he actually developed, I believe, many of his ideas starting with limnology, starting with the water bugs that he'd been studying since he was 15. He wrote his first paper at age 15. And going out from there into these many different fields. He also had friends that had nothing to do with ecology in particular. That's Rebecca West, a remarkable person. At 18, she was an actress in London. Rebecca West is a pseudonym. She was in an Ibsen play where the main character was named Rebecca West. And after that, about 19, she got a job as a literary critic on an London newspaper. She became H.G. Wells' mistress. She started writing novels herself and had this long career. She was actually on the cover of Time magazine as the most famous woman writer. But later in life, she did a lot of reporting, Nuremberg trials, lynch trials in the United States, South Africa, a lot of important things for the newspaper and for the New Yorker. And the two of them wrote letters almost daily about their lives. So you can read these letters and find out what Hutchinson was doing, what he was thinking. And in the next one here, there she is as the author. His letters, the letters that she sent him, he gave to the Beinecke. I don't think he charged them, he just gave them to Beinecke. But she died before the letters that Hutchinson wrote to her were distributed. And his children, her son, sold them to the highest bidder, which was the University of Tulsa. So I spent several days reading these letters at the University of Tulsa. But the letters were important in finding out many things, and one of them had to do with Aldabra. A lot of people that read this book, including some of his graduate students, had no idea about Hutchinson's work as an environmentalist. And I don't think Hutchinson would have called himself a feminist in that era. He was just a humanist who helped women. And environmentalist was a bad word to mainstream ecologists during this period and for quite a long time. But he did environmental work. Some of it was basic research, for which he won several different environmental awards, and one of them had to do with green slime up there, the eutrophication of lakes, not the natural eutrophication, which simply means enrichment of nutrients, but eutrophication that was going on because of human activities. And he figured out that phosphorus was the culprit. All of the soap sud companies didn't believe that or didn't want to believe that. It was later proved by other ecologists. But he also he's also always someone who cared about biodiversity and was really worried about extinction. And in his other career as a historian of medieval art from these illuminated manuscripts, he actually looked at biodiversity in birds in the 14th century. He figured out what all those birds were that were living in England during that period from the illuminated manuscripts, among other things. But the Aldabra story is a really interesting one, and we really wouldn't know it except for the letters that he wrote to Rebecca West. I mean, it was known that he was an early member of the National Academy of Sciences, and the National Academy sent him to England to talk to the Royal Society, of which he was a foreign member, because the English and American governments were trying to set up an airfield on the island of Aldabra in the Indian Ocean. And the members of the Royal Society were not being very vocal about doing anything about it. But he described this whole trip in a letter to Rebecca West, and it's very interesting. And I'll read you something here about Aldabra. This is a letter of protest about, quote, the imminent extinction of the gigantic land tortoises. The giant tortoise flourished with the dodo and the solitaire, and while it is a matter of lasting regret that not even a few individuals of these curious birds should have had the chance of surviving the lawless conditions of past centuries, it is confidently hoped that the present government and people will find a means of saving the last examples of their contemporaries. And at that time, there was a lot of woodcutting also. That was from 1874, and the signatories to that letter included Charles Darwin, and actually they did stop the lumbering. The work that they were doing to make it an air base would have really destroyed not only the tortoise populations, but a lot of bird populations that were endemic to the islands. And finally that didn't happen, partly because of a film that a British man made of the island, but partly, I think, also because of Hutchinson's efforts. And there's a line from McNamara who said, "I'm sure glad to have all those scientists off my back," when it finally was resolved. No, whole career. That was something I made for a different meeting. He also won a great many other honors. He won the Franklin Medal, which started with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Edison as winners. And when he was asked what he had invented, other people said he had invented modern ecology. And this is being given out. The person speaking is Ruth Patrick, who was a longtime associate of Hutchinson's from her earliest days. She worked on diatoms and did some fascinating diatom ecology that I read at an early age. And they worked together in Lindsley Pond early on and remained friends throughout their lives. And the one on the right is Marjorie Garber, who is now a Shakespeare scholar and professor at Harvard. I think their connection at Yale was at the Elizabethan Club. Hutchinson gave a whole set of his reprints, I sure wish I had had one, to two women who were not biologists, one to Marjorie Garber and one to Phoebe Ellsworth, another friend from his college, Saybrook, at Yale. So he did have close friends who were not actually connected with his science. He was interested in all kinds of other people's ideas. Finally, Hutchinson never got a doctorate, and I discuss that in the book, and you could read it, see what you think. For one thing, he didn't want to stay in Cambridge after he graduated. One of his friends had written to Cambridge, you could actually send your papers into Cambridge and obtain a doctorate that way, and I know someone who did that. But his friend was turned down, so I think early in his career he was worried about that. Later in his career, he was famous and he was sort of proud of not having a doctorate. There's a story about someone, who was it, Tom? Came in and addressed you both as Dr. Hutchinson and Dr. Lovejoy, and Evelyn said, "Oh, I'm too old," and Tom is too young. But he finally was given an honorary degree together with Max Perutz and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the foreign minister and a woman professor, literature professor from Oxford. That's a whole bunch of them. A tremendously pompous thing. And there he is with his sister-in-law, Hannah, his brother Leslie's wife, afterwards. And he was already, I think, about 80 when this happened. And Margaret already was too ill to go with him, but his sister Dorothea, who became his correspondent after both Margaret and Rebecca West died, took care of him. And here he is in his old age, still at Yale. He stayed at Yale. He did work in writing all the time he was there. And Christina Spiesel, who I think is coming tonight, did a portrait of him at this age in a bust. However, he was worried that he was not going to finish the fourth volume of the treatise in limnology while he is still alive, and actually he got most of the writing done, but not the figures, and many loving people finished the book for him, students and others. And finally, at the age of, I think, 83, he won the Kyoto Prize. He was the first scientist to win the Kyoto Prize, which is essentially the Japanese equivalent of the Nobel Prize, but there's no Nobel Prize for ecologists. And at that point, he was quite frail, but his third wife, Anne, took him, much younger than he, took him to Tokyo and back. And he gave a really interesting speech with some of his ideas. for instance, about the evolution of homosexuality, a subject he was been interested in off and on at that age. And finally, his wife died unexpectedly, and his relatives took him back to England. And even after that, he got to know some of his nieces and nephews very well in the short time he had to live. And he stayed with Yamil, the little girl who had lived with them during World War II and had become a ballet dancer. And I think we're all here to celebrate his life. And I got one more thing I've got to tell you. Tom Odom, one more quote here. He was the graduate student who became a well-known systems ecologist, and he was actually on the list of people to be invited to this lecture, but he died in 2002, so that was not possible. I actually went down to interview him in Florida while he was still alive, and I arranged this with Odom beforehand, and I got there and I called up and his wife said, no, I couldn't see him because he'd just come home from the hospital after a brain operation. So I was very sorry about all of that, but I had friends there and I stayed a couple more days. And then he called me and he said, Nancy, I'm much better. Come on over and talk to me. And we had a very interesting discussion. By that time, he had become a non-mainstream ecologist, but he still had a lot of people, especially in Europe, that were interested in his ideas. I think he had written 2 chapters in his brother Gene Odom's book, which were probably the most significant new chapters for ecology. And he also was one of those who wrote about Hutchinson, and this is the last quote. It is difficult for one person to see the whole of a many-dimensional phenomenon. An overriding characteristic of Hutchinson is his imaginative ability to use important implications in small detailed matters, to see important implications in small detailed matters and thus become genuinely excited. This absolute love of knowledge is ideal as an environment for the student who is getting his first results, or for an American-type student raised in a materialistic society where such worship of the intellectual is rare. Hutchinson teaches with superbly clear lectures, leveled at the top of the class, but with numerous anecdotes which keep the rest of the class at least along in spirit. Hutchinson balances a complete personal humility with a scorching criticism of scientific work in the literature, which serves to teach the student by example the difference between good and bad research. He's immensely kind, but also immensely immersed. Science and ideas are his interest. He is also as impartial to personalities and creeds of his students as is conceivably possible. A great person. Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Nancy. I know it's a real challenge to compress such a long life into a talk, and you've done a wonderful job of that. Thank you. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, David Skelly, who, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the co-editors of the book, The Art of Ecology, just to briefly explain how the book came about and why they picked the papers they've done.
So this should just go for another hour or so. No, I'm just going to speak for a few minutes. My doctoral advisor, Earl Werner, has few regrets about his graduate career, but one of the ones that he expressed to me is that he finished his dissertation 6 months too late to be on that tree that was shown in Nancy's talk. I think Nancy set up the challenge for a group of people to put together an anthology of someone who made this range of contributions. And I'm up here on behalf of a group of people, David Post, a fellow editor who is here, Melinda Smith, who is not here with us today, and a set of contributors, both to the volume. I think Michael Donahue, in addition to the people I've just mentioned, Michael Donahue and Jane Pickering are with us today. There were a couple of others, including Nancy and Sharon Kingsland, who was shown in the talk here, and also a set of folks who came to give presentations at that centenary symposium that really kind of set the tone and really the challenge. And rather than go through the ideas and the systems and so on, Nancy's done a great job of that. I want to leave you just with one thing that I think transcends all of Hutchinson's work. I think David and I share a sense of humility in the job that we were given to put together an anthology for someone like this. David never met Hutchinson. I never met him. Melinda Smith never met him. But in a sense, we represent kind of a handoff to the future. All of us had experiences as graduate students and afterwards where we learned about Hutchinson's ideas and the importance of them. And my sense has been over the 15 years that I've been at Yale that it has been harder and harder for students to come by that sense of what Hutchinson offered. And so this, to us, who, unlike many of you, we're not friends with Hutchinson, don't remember him as a warm human being, but really it comes down to the ideas. It's the utility of the ideas. What do they do for us going into the future? And I think all of us shared the sense that the famous papers that Nancy showed still have something to offer, but what is really remarkable is what happens when you go beyond the papers that are still taught in classical ecology type seminars and so on. Digging into what this one person was able to accomplish is both humbling, but it's also enormously inspiring. And just to kind of cap it off, I think what has been most influential to me, and this goes back to really the first year when I was studying ecology with Earl, who had been deeply influenced by Hutchinson and had me read a bunch of his papers, was the fact that Hutchinson had a very particular approach that was really based on observation. This natural history tradition that Hutchinson was born into wasn't just a pastime where you put on your suit and tie and you went out with your little net and collected things on Sunday. It was a way of encountering the world and learning about it. And it wasn't just that you put stuff into the jars and said, job done, but you thought about what you'd found very deeply and critically, and you come up with ideas, and then you batter on those ideas really hard. You're tough on them. And in that, I think he shared a very close similarity with Darwin. Darwin was his own toughest critic who worked in a very similar manner, collecting observations over a long period of time, sifting them, grinding them up, and seeing what withstood his own tough critique. Hutchinson's ideas, the niche ideas, even the limiting similarity ideas, have evolved themselves into enduring concepts in ecology. So the 1.3 thing per se didn't work out, perhaps, but the idea that competition is an ongoing force that shapes phenotypes out there and other interactions are doing the same has had a vibrant life and continues to have a vibrant life. The seeds of metapopulation theory and a whole bunch of other ideas that have taken on their own lives are there, and they come from Hutchinson. And the reason, you know, he thought about so many different things, but I think one of the things to walk away from and to explore both in Nancy's book and in the anthology is that this is someone who was so successful because he started with things that were true, things that were real. These weren't convenient ideas. They weren't ideas that came out of Hutchinson's values, even though he cared about environmental issues and so on. They were things that he couldn't discard, that he couldn't ignore. And I think that some of that kind of thinking could really help us today negotiate the challenges that we have, rather than wishing things were one way or the other, being tough on those ideas and taking them forward. Thanks.
I'd like to now call on Leo Buss to give some insights into what I think would be a very intimidating thing, is to be a new starting ecology professor in Hutchinson's shadow at Yale. So.
I came to Yale in 1979. Evelyn retired in 71, so he was like emeritus for a decade by the time I showed up. I was in the same location I am now. Evelyn was across the hall. For those of you who know the geography, that's where Gunter is now. Evelyn, for the entire last decade of his life, was being driven almost exclusively by listening to the clock tick. He was trying to get the fourth volume of the treatise done, and it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. And that's what he thought about when he woke up in the morning. That's what he did as much as he could all day long. I think he already knew by the time that I came that the treatise was not going to get done. He was working on the benthos, and the benthos was farthest from his area of expertise. I think he was sort of shocked by the scope of the benthos when he got into it, and had already laid out what he wanted to do in that volume, and it was more than a decade long. It was a monumental task. Not only was it a monumental task, but at the time I arrived, he was laboring under the advanced stages of Margaret's Alzheimer's, and so he effectively couldn't do any work. Her doctor had told him that she was doing as well as she was because of the loving care he was giving her. And those of us who knew Hutchinson knew that that was the death knell. As soon as he heard that, he was going to be there every single day and he wasn't going to take any help. And that's exactly what happened all the way to the end. He came in every day, but only for like an hour or two, and there were crazy machinations to get him that hour or two. So Sarah Twombly, who was his real last student, he had a lot of last students, but the real last one, Sarah Twombly, she would just sort of show up, for a visit to Evelyn's house, and Margaret would know what was going on, right? But within 15 minutes, Margaret forgot what was going on, and so Sarah could, in fact, be visiting, and Evelyn could go off to the library for an hour or two. But even then, of course, he was getting next to nothing done because he was keeping the house, he was preparing the food, and he was dealing with someone who really wasn't there anymore. That was true for the first several years that I was here and interacted closely with him. When Margaret died, which was, 82, 83, something like that, there was a period of 4 or 5 years where Evelyn could really get to work, and he did get to work. He was there every day, all day long, and he was working essentially exclusively on the treatise. And he was increasingly a happy guy, He was enjoying what he was doing. But he was also, there was also this, this sense that only increased in intensity, that he wasn't getting it done at the right rate, right? At that time, I spent a lot of time with him, partly because he just needed help, but also because, for whatever reason, we just got along, and got to some sense of sort of, what his life was at that time. He was sort of a loner, He didn't seek people out. He had no close interactions with his colleagues. The only people in the then biology department who interacted with him at all was Willard Hartman, his former student. Occasionally, Luigi Provasoli would come by, but very few interactions with his colleagues. And he didn't precipitate it. I think he was, basically in some ways a fundamentally shy guy. But just, a wonderfully warm guy if you got anywhere close to his sphere of influence. But you had to bump into him. He wasn't going to bump into you. He was, not only did he not become active, not only did a lot of his colleagues in biology not interact with him, he was like completely emotionally decoupled from what was going on in the department at the time. And some of you may remember, this was a time when ecology as a field was going through wild fluctuations at Yale. And he was not in any material way involved in that process, nor was he in any material way emotionally involved in that process. So he was a bit of a loner, but he wasn't a lonely guy, not at all. He had a number of close friends here. Catherine Skinner, for example, Luigi Provosoli, Willard Hartman. He had very close relationships with a couple of students, Stan Raschutin, Janie Wolfe, Saren Twombly. And he had a continuing series of visitors from mostly his former students that just lit him up. You know, when Tom came, you could tell when Tom was coming. He just lit up like a light bulb when Tom was coming. The same was true with Donna Haraway. The same was true with Karen Porter. For some of you in the audience, you know these people's names. And these people came on a very periodic sort of basis. They were not like rare visitors. So he was by no means lonely. And he would then, of course, be besieged by supplicants who would want to come and meet the great man. So although he was not, materially involved with people in, the local intellectual community, the building, if you will, every seminar speaker who came through just absolutely had to, meet Hutchinson, right? And of course, he was just totally unfailingly gracious and wonderful with these people, even though he really wanted to get back to work on the treatise. There was no question about that. And so people would come to his office, and he'd have this sort of characteristic way of meeting them. He'd say, "I don't have any idea of what you do, and I hope that you'll tell me about it." Okay, and we're sitting in the back of the lab going, "Yeah, and I wish you would go away." But you'd never hear it. And of course, they felt so welcomed, and they'd start, an outpouring. And sometimes they were interesting, and they were spewing natural history, and Evelyn got into it. More often than not, there was some component of idolatry to the conversation, and he just didn't have any time for that. And so he tended to cut those conversations off very shortly, but not in sort of a conventional way. When you're having a conversation with somebody that's sort of free-flowing, you might just, something may come to your mind, and you'll say, that thing you said made me think about X, right? And X has got nothing to do with anything. Evelyn would just say X. He'd do no preamble, right? So he'd come out with this stupid non sequitur, right? And then the person would sort of pause because they didn't know what's going on here. And then Evelyn would get up. If Evelyn got up, that meant the conversation was over, right? Because he'd get up and he'd sort of shamble his way up and he'd reach out his hand, and then these people would go away and study the comment that Evelyn made at great length, looking for some profundity there, and it just wasn't there. At any rate, I remember a lot of my interactions with him. I studied competition when I first came to Yale, and so we talked a lot about competition because that was the way he thought about ecological problems. And I studied with Jeremy Jackson, who's in the audience, and we studied these things that grew on 2 dimensions as sheets. Think about lichens on a tree that interacted in their margins. And so Evelyn just loved that because Evelyn didn't think about competition that way. I'm going to drop occasionally into code here, but the ecologists might find it useful in the audience. He thought about competition as an exploitative process. Okay? He thought about the equilibrium solutions to the Locke-de-Volterra equations as being the only evolutionary outcome, or the primary evolutionary outcome of competition. And that led to all the ideas about limiting similarity, niche partitioning, and all the like. All right? But this was, of course, a story about interference competition, and it was a story primarily about alternative evolutionary outcomes, basically getting good at one thing versus another, just as long as your environment guaranteed that both things were around. And so Evelyn just, sopped up that natural history at no end, and immediately appreciated that in the systems that I was working on, you could ask questions about the community consequences of competition that were completely distinct from the intellectual tradition that he had spawned. And he just loved that. When he loved something, he'd say, marvelous. You know, he'd go, marvelous. I can't do that. Can you do this? So you have to do the marvelous for me. So in some ways, he was just a delight to talk with. In other ways, he was like totally inaccessible. I remember being like completely confused with reactions that he had to discussions about the current state of ecology. So he could not be engaged in any meaningful way in sort of what was happening to the ideas that he had generated and how they were being systematically dismantled and misinterpreted and just done wrong, you know? He just couldn't be interested in this stuff. You know, as far as he was concerned, there was competitive exclusion, and if there were predators that were keeping densities so low that competition didn't happen, that was just another way in which competitive exclusion was suppressed. It went click, you could hear it go into the file cabinet in his head, you know, everything got organized, he put it where it belonged. Rather than, so you couldn't engage him on the notion that, hey, wait, maybe communities are getting controlled by top-down controls that are fundamentally different, and maybe all that stuff you wrote didn't make a whole lot of difference. He wasn't interested in that, and I couldn't get it. I just could not get how this guy could be so emotionally decoupled from the fate of his ideas. But of course, that was about, I was 25, right? I'm pretty emotionally disconnected to what I did when I was 25, too. So it's not too surprising. A comment about Evelyn and women. He was busy, unless you were a woman. If you were a woman, Evelyn would spend as much time with you as you would like. I remember graduate students and faculty in our department coming to talk to me about why Evelyn wouldn't talk to them. You know, he talks to her. The guy was funny. He was like any woman he would talk to for any length of time, and he was an incredible flirt, and he loved to be flirted with, right? Today, he would be in trouble if he was on the faculty at Yale. But he was enormously supportive. For those people that he was close to, he would do anything. And I look back on my career, I never asked him for a letter or anything. I had, any of that kind of need for him. But later I learned that Evelyn was doing things to facilitate my career that I knew nothing about. And this is at a time when he had, better things to be doing. And so I can easily see how, that tree ramified. People who are that successful at mentoring, that's never a mistake. Just a few more words. The first part of the time I met him, he was having great difficulty with Margaret and doing nothing but giving. The end of his life hasn't been mentioned here, and that was even more difficult. His third marriage was to a woman named Anne, who proved ultimately to be an alcoholic. And the time period from about 1980, 87 maybe, Tom, 88, certainly till 90, when his own health problems started to kick in a very major way. He started getting transient episodes, so little strokes and the like. they were extraordinarily difficult. I didn't know what was going on at the time, but I knew something was going on because Evelyn would show up at the office disheveled, and Evelyn was never disheveled. He would show up with bruises, and he would show up with little cuts, and that would be okay. You know, people of that age, frequently, run into things and cut themselves and stuff, but they weren't dressed cuts. Something was wrong. And for that last several years, I frequently walked him home to Cantor Street from OML because there was nobody taking care of him. And he would, if I was leaving and he wasn't, and he was still there, I walked him home. And as soon as we would get close to Cantor Street, he would get increasingly sort of uncomfortable. And I knew at the time there was something wrong here. Something was, fundamentally not right. And one of my greatest regrets in life is I didn't do anything about it. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think, I had any business going inside that door and finding out what it was. But ultimately, the end of his life was as difficult as the period he was going through when I first came. He had, in that decade when I knew him, a central 3 or 4 or 5 really good years, bookend by, really fairly profound misery. And the last thought I want you to leave you with about Evelyn was that he never once complained, never once said anything that was anything less than completely gracious, including about the 2 women that were the bookends. Thank you.
And last but not least, Tom, the floor is yours. Okay.
So, it is late, and I will not take a lot of time. But I was asked to just sort of give my impressions of what it was like to be one of those very lucky people to be one of Evelyn's students. And here is a man who's capable of producing these grand syntheses and these huge volumes, but at the same time was famous for what today we would call the soundbite. So I was thinking, what would be the soundbite for Evelyn? That he was wise, kindly, incandescently brilliant, and a veritable ecological Dumbledore. Because you could ask him about anything, and you would get a really interesting answer. And his friends included people like art history professor George Kubler, who worked on all the wonderful archaeological things in the Yucatan, and they worked together on the hypothesis that there had been ecological overreach and use of the land. And so that was one of the great joys of being a student, because anything could come up, and something very interesting and often profound would be said. It seems to me an obvious one of his characteristics that he really had an eye for talent and intellectual talent, and not just in science. But I remember he was one of the very first who identified Robert May when he showed up at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton as an extraordinary figure who would be contributing in really important ways to ecological science. And virtually within weeks of Leo appearing at Yale, I remember Evelyn saying, "You must talk to Leo Buss." And so it never occurred to me until this morning, thinking about what I might say, that the fact that Robert May and Leo Buss were on the first visiting committee that I put together for my Forest Fragments project was yet another contribution from Evelyn. And we heard from David, in particular, but also in the way Leo talked about the file cabinet in Evelyn's mind, that theory and natural history had to fit together. And if the theory didn't fit the facts in nature, well, then it was something wrong with the theory, because nature was real. And so he sort of looked at everything in terms of frameworks of understanding. And I remember talking to him when I was towards the end of my thesis and had sort of discovered that in all these different forests and forest gradients I was looking at in the Amazon, that the most abundant bird species were the same ones in all these different situations. And Evelyn said, "Oh," he said, "that's part of that larger problem of why two communities are so similar that you find the same species in the same number, but at the other end of the spectrum, you don't expect to find rotifers in the desert or giraffes on the bottom of the sea." So that was the way he always thought about things, and one of his other favorite phrases about some particular piece of natural history would be most peculiar. And he had a real interest for the most peculiar, because those, in fact, were the ones that would really test the theory. And I actually remember I had the delight of going to Cambridge and see him get his honorary degree, and then flew back with him to Kennedy, and we're in the front row of economy, and there's this movie screen right in front of us with, of all things, Popeye. You know, this is all this stuff going on, you can't ignore it, it's right in front of your eyes, and he looks up and says, "Most peculiar." So the other thing, as I think about it, is it just one of the treats about being one of his students was being with all the other of his students, who could be studying anything from mosses to coral reefs or biogeochemical cycles or Cladocera. And I don't remember anything other than a feeling of joy of being part of that community. I think everybody felt that. And he just made you be better than you otherwise would be, because you just wanted to hear that word, marvelous, right? And you worked hard enough that you could get there. So I leave you with one story. I was somewhere with Gerardo Budowski, who was a graduate of the forestry school, and who had taken one course in population ecology with Evelyn. And when he discovered that I had had the honor to be Evelyn's student, he said, "Yeah, my head is still full of him." And I think that's true for every one of his students and many of us in this room. Thank you.
Tom. just real quickly, one of the reasons why we're here today is because of the passion and endurance of an unsung hero, sort of, in this process of actually getting the books from the writing stage, the assembly stage, to the publication stage. And just really quickly, we'd all just give a hand of thanks to Jean Black, who really was largely responsible for making sure that these books got published and got the word out. So thank you very much, Jean, for your hard work.